and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. President Idriss Deby of Chad is one of the world's longest-ruling national leaders, having first taken power in 1990, in much the same fashion as every Chadian ruler before him, an armed rebellion. Since then, Chad has continued to struggle with high rates of poverty and severe developmental challenges, even as security forces ruthlessly suppress even the slightest sign of dissent. But under Deby's watch, the country has also taken on a number of important roles in regional security and counterinsurgency efforts that are backed by Western governments, including Chad's former colonial power, France. Those efforts have earned Deby considerable loyalty in Paris and other Western capitals. The aging dictator announced a cabinet reshuffle earlier this month in preparation to run for president yet again next year. But this raises questions about how far Deby is willing to go to hold on to power, and how far his Western backers are willing to go to keep him firmly ensconced in the presidential palace in the capital, N'Djamena. Joining me now to discuss is Michael Shirkin, a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, where he works on West African security issues and U.S. and European strategy. Michael, welcome to Trendlines.
Thank you.
Given Chad's history, when Idriss Deby first took power in 1990, do you think many people expected he would still be leading the country 3 decades later?
Absolutely not. I mean, I really can't imagine how anybody in 1990 would have taken those odds. I mean, by the time that Deby took over, the institutions of the country, which were never very strong at all, were basically in ruins. The country had completely fragmented. You had all sorts of ethnic groups and cliques within the ethnic groups and sort of sub-cliques that were all sort of fighting one another and vying for power. And whoever ran Chad at the time, including Deby, clearly would be running it in the name of a certain sort of network of families or cliques or clans. And given the sort of the fragmented nature of Chadian society then as in now, there's absolutely no good reason why any one of those would be able to hold power in the face of any of the others. It's not like a majority clan or even a large minority clan. These are just sort of small subsections that benefit directly from the rule, and they're outnumbered by everybody else. So it just stands to reason that cannot possibly stand for any length of time.
How much of that fragmented nature of Chadian society can be traced back to French colonial rule?
In some ways, none of it, and that has to do with pre-colonial Chad. People often talk about how colonial countries were, these countries that were born out of colonialism were manufactured by the colonists, and that the lines are just drawn arbitrarily. That's true to greater or lesser extents depending on the country. I mean, some colonial countries, post-colonial countries, actually had some pre-colonial legitimacy, right? Whereas Chad is actually a great example of a country that should not exist, in effect. And the borders of Chad and the fact that Chad exists has to do with all sorts of strange French bureaucratic inter-service rivalries, all sorts of things that have nothing to do with anything. So you have a large agglomeration of different groups who really have very little in common. They just happen to fall within the borders of some French administrative subdivision, if you will. And if we were to blame France for anything other than, its arbitrary lines, or the fact that they were in the first place, it's that they actually invested so little in Chad that the result was that the potential for the colonial experience to have created any kind of commonalities, to have forged some sort of common identity, was really it wasn't tapped. In other words, the French just didn't do much of that at all. Very, very light footprint, very superficial influence. And so you can't really blame them for dividing up the country. You can kind of blame them for drawing a circle around a bunch of people who had nothing to do with one another, and then for not making much of an effort to really increase that coherence. That said, there are some groups that they favored over others. There's some people who did better than under colonialism than others, which generated various resentments and issues. But there's always an element of divide and conquer to the way colonial powers like France ruled. But that said, the place was so fragmented to begin with that I don't really see this as a case of, like you can blame France for a lot of things, but I don't want to blame France for that. In the sense that the French are guilty of the sin of omission rather than commission.
So Deby takes over in 1990, having ousted his predecessor, Hissène Habré. There have been multiple threats to Deby's rule, multiple attempted coups since then. How does he go about fighting these off?
To some extent, it's just sheer skill and cunning. He is a very capable ruler. He's very good at manipulating factions, dividing and conquering, co-opting. He will be brutal when he needs to be brutal. He will suppress the people he needs to suppress. And he's very good at that. Plus, of course, he's a very gifted military commander. So when these wars become, when the conflicts are actually become military ones, he's really very much in his element. But it's also very clear that from the very beginning he's had support from France and to a lesser extent from the United States, and he has been very skillful in cultivating these relationships with France and the United States. And this dates back to well before the current war on terrorism. This has to do with French and American opposition to Gaddafi's Libya, as well as to the regime in Sudan. And Deby was always more or less an enemy of those two governments, which made him a friend of Paris and Washington. And so he was always able to use those to strengthen his hand, to curry favor in all sorts of various ways. And he also, I think, benefited from the fact that there's a period where Franco-American rivalries were such that one would have to play this tightrope in terms of getting too friendly with one side or the other. And there are a lot of people who think that après, that the French let him go, they let him fall rather than keep him in power because he'd become too friendly with the Americans. By the time Deby's in power, that stage in the Franco-American relationship, if you will, was sort of over. And so there's not much to lose by cultivating the one as opposed to the other because both are fine with it. And these days, absolutely, both Washington and Paris are fine with Deby. And there's, he's not going to offend the one by seeming to be too chummy with the other. But you can see it as cunning, political cunning, and skill, as well as his ability to cultivate his relationship with France and the United States. And then I think also we have to add to this the fact that in, I believe, 2003, oil production came online, which gave him access to a source of cash that has proved invaluable for staying in power, for paying off people, for clientelism, for buying weapons. He was supposed to use the money as per an agreement he had made with the World Bank. He was supposed to use the money for development and put some of it into some sort of rainy day fund and do all sorts of really good things with it. He broke his agreement and basically has just looted the revenue stream for his own political gains. That said, that money is I don't know if it's there anymore because the price of oil has gone down so much that it's a real problem for Deby. But so you can combine all these things, and I think they all kind of combine to explain how is it that he's managed to stay in power for so long.
There was one particular case of an attempted rebellion last year that was put down with a considerable helping hand from the French. Tell us about that, if you will.
Sure. So there was basically a rebel column. It's always sort of the same thing. It's this sort of razzia, this sort of mobile column. This is sort of how war is done. Imagine rebels in a large convoy with mostly like pickup trucks and technicals and whatnot. And they just sort of surge across the desert and kind of race to the capital and in a bid to take out Deby. It's not the first time it happened. It happened also in 2008, I think also 2006. So there are two things that are interesting about this. First of all, it's the fact that the leader of this rebel offensive is Timon Erdemi, who is a nephew of Deby. And that's interesting to me because it really shows the extent to which so much of politics of Chad are really defined by not just sort of political parties and different ethnic groups that are competing with one another, but it's sort of factions within factions within factions. So, this in effect would have been sort of a family feud between Timon Erdemi and I believe his twin brother versus Deby. The origins of this, I believe, have to do with the Chad's involvement in the Darfur conflict and the subsequent relations with Sudan. And by and large, it's like, in addition to managing the country, Deby has to manage his family, and he has to make sure that everybody's happy. But sure enough, if he favors one cousin, another cousin becomes resentful. Now there's an issue with Deby's his wife has taken a prominent role. So the other family that's not related to this wife because he's had other wives, like it's sort of this crazy complex family, tribal politic situation. And part of the things that is very disconcerting about this is the extent to which it's hard to speak of there being an opposition as much as if Timon or Dimi were to have defeated Deby, there's absolutely zero reason to think that Timon or Dimi would be any better a ruler than Deby, right? It would rather be, it's just he's going to take the pie from Deby and keep the pie for himself or divide it up as he sees fit. But it's not like, it's not like, oh, this really sincere democratic resistance or even this enlightened despot's going to replace Deby. It's just going to be sort of more of the same. So I think that's very disconcerting. But then the other thing that's very interesting, of course, is the French decision to intervene directly in this. So the French forces that are in Chad, and there have been French forces in Chad on and off fairly consistently since decolonization. But the forces that are currently in Chad now are officially part of what's called Operation Barkhane. Operation Barkhane is a counterterrorism thing, or rather its official purpose, its mission is to fight terrorism. It is a regional counterterrorism effort. This is the operation, this is the French military effort that's targeting the Islamists in Mali and Burkina Faso and in Western Niger. And the headquarters of Barkhane are in N'Djamena, which is also significant. That sort of tells you something about sort of the comfort the French have with Deby as a counterterrorism partner. The headquarters are in N'Djamena, and there's a major at the N'Djamena National, the airport, international airport. There's basically a French base on the premises. And so if you go there, if you fly to the N'Djamena airport, you will see, among other things, you will see French warplanes on the tarmac and the French aerial tankers and whatnot. And so ostensibly the fighter aircraft that are based in N'Djamena and everything that's based in N'Djamena is there to fight terrorists. And the focus of the fight is mostly to the west, but also to some extent in the Lake Chad Basin. And here you have the French taking assets that are there ostensibly for the counterterrorism fight, and they're intervening into intra-Chadian politics by taking out a rebel threat. It's not the first time France has done this, but it really demonstrates the level of commitment that France has to keeping Deby in power, notwithstanding the discomfort that I believe the French have, along with the United States and everybody else, with the fact that Deby's far from being a democratic leader. He's not what people would like him to be, but he's what people need him to be, if you will, from the point of view of the West. Such that the French are really willing to, they've got some skin in the game, and they're willing to use munitions, and they're willing to basically kill people for the sake of keeping Deby in power. Again, this is not the first time this happened. I believe it happened also in 2008. And then 2006, I believe French fighter planes, I don't know if they actually fired on a rebel convoy or if they just did what's called a show of force, which is where you, from what I understand, it's basically you fly in at low altitude and you buzz the rebel columns. And if you've ever been to an air show, you can imagine how loud a French Mirage F1 fighter plane is. That it's who's trying to scare the heck out of you.
But in this case, the column that was advancing from Libya was actually taken out by those French jets, right?
Right. So this time they actually bombed the column, and that was that. I mean, it has a double effect. First of all, it ends the immediate threat to Deby, but then it also sends a signal to anybody else who's contemplating doing something similar, right? So any would-be rebel who's thinking about doing this razzia and doing this raid to N'Djamena to topple Deby knows full well that some French Rafale are going to drop some JDAMs on him. And why give that a try? Why do that?
Makes a lot of sense. You mentioned some of the sort of the danger zones that are around Chad, the Darfur region of Sudan that's been prone to conflict, Libya to the north, Central African Republic to the south that has a history of violent conflict. What has Deby's approach been to security to prevent any of these threats from spilling over into Chad's boundaries, or if they do spill over, to minimize the damage?
Well, first of all, they do spill over, and part of the problem is that since a lot of the populations on these borders overlap the borders, that it's very hard to isolate the one thing from another. So it's hard to isolate the Darfur conflict with conflicts that are going on the other side of the border, because all the ethnic groups that are involved in the Darfur conflict are also more or less on the Chadian side of the border. The same is true with the Libyan border with certain population groups, and also the Lake Chad region, and the border with the Central African Republic. So you cannot isolate it. There's no way that Chad can set up some sort of cordon sanitaire, right, to just sort of wall off the country. But he can do a number of things. First of all, to some extent, these conflicts have been also opportunities for him, right? So if there are, he can exploit the conflict in Darfur, and this is what he did for a while by supporting Darfur rebels, right? And of course, Sudan was supporting Chadian rebels. So you've got this sort of tit for tat thing going on, but it also means that he's got some leverage and he's got some ability to kind of manage the relationship with the Sudanese government at the time.
This was under the reign of Omar al-Bashir, right? Before he was overthrown?
Right. This is under the reign of Bashir, exactly. Since sort of the peak of the conflict, in the past 10 years, Deby had really managed to improve relations with Bashir, and there was a real sort of détente between the two countries, and which meant that they basically agreed to sort of stop meddling in each other's internal affairs, but also to stop supporting each other's rebel groups, which also I believe was a problem for Deby, in that members of Deby's family were very much involved with the conflict in Darfur, and so by forging better relations with Bashir, he actually angered those members of his own family who were invested in that conflict. So that was a problem. And to some extent, the removal of Bashir has actually complicated things for Deby, because, having a strong man that he had a good working relationship with on the other side of the border was probably sort of the better option for Deby. And of course, he wouldn't want Chadians to draw any lessons about what mass protests might be able to do in terms of overturning a regime. But either way, you've got these conflicts in these countries, and I think to some extent Deby was able to make the most of these things, and sort of cast himself as sort of the good guy in this. So Deby, for the Darfur conflict, and because of the fact that the United States and France weren't happy with the Sudanese government, Deby was able to cast himself as sort of, he's the partner, right? And for whatever leverage you want to put on Bashir's government because of Darfur, because of anything else, I can be useful to you, and that worked. And the same thing with leveraging with dealing with Gaddafi, but by and large, these overlaps have been a problem, and because of the fact that there are conflicts within Chad that really mirror these conflicts on the other side of the border, he's usually dealt with these problems with a very strong arm, generally just sort of suppressing dissent, suppressing opposition, and just sort of really keeping a firm grip on things, and playing whatever game he can in terms of manipulating people or co-opting people and doing whatever to just try to manage it. And I think that analysts generally agree that the problem that exists now is that a lot of these problems, which have been going on for a long time, problems having to do with, like herders versus farmers, or this ethnic group versus that ethnic group, rather than actually deal with the problem or solve the problem or work to some sort of a resolution that everybody could be happy with and can move on, his managing it has always ultimately amounted to deflection or just sort of tamping it down. And so everything is still a problem. All the old problems are still problems. They haven't gone away. And everything's still sort of festering. And therefore, every once in a while, there's an eruption. For instance, recently, there have been problems in Eastern Chad having to do with different ethnic groups in a mirror image of stuff that's been going on in Darfur to some extent. And it's a problem that he deals with by just trying to suppress it, but not solve it.
It's almost like it's a self-perpetuating crisis that sort of gives him a rationale or a legitimacy to stay in power.
Yes, Yes and no. So, right. So, I don't think he does it because it gives him a irrational stay in power. Although I think that it does help him when he wants to make the argument. Like, I don't think that's his motive. I don't think he's that cynical, or at least I'm not that cynical. It does give him the ammunition to be able to say the material, to be able to say, like, look, you need me in power because if I go, like what is it, Louis XIV, he should have whoever said allegedly, like, yeah, après moi le déluge, after me the flood, right? So if I go, there's going to be disaster. And it's a plausible argument, right? If he falls and there's some sort of power vacuum, and we can talk about this later, he who's somehow managed to keep this messy thing of Chad sort of kind of together, sort of, that will go away, and that's really bad. So that's part of his argument for staying in power. That said, I think it's more the problem is that the problems don't go away, which means they're still there, and it could get worse. And one of the ways that it could get worse, or there are two ways that it could get worse. One is that I think most people agree that, analysts agree that climate change is exacerbating a lot of problems. So much of the sort of agriculture in this part of the world, agriculture and animal husbandry, is affected by rainfall patterns. And with people who are nomadic herders, there's this amazing, I love this word, the transhumance, where it's like literally, like, because of the rainfall patterns, the grass is going to be a little bit greener in that valley at a different time of the year than in that valley. So you're going to migrate from one valley to the other based on your understanding of where the grass is just a little bit greener, based on your understanding of rainfall patterns, etc. This is sort of how nomads survive. Extremely difficult way to make a living, just to survive, but this is what people do. But because of changing rainfall patterns, all this is kind of thrown apart. So you've got growing population with all sorts of, with limited resources, and then the climate change is like a big wrench in the works and just makes everything worse. The other problem has to do with Islamic radicalism and the potential for Islamic radicalism to take off. And this is also something that Deby's been struggling to tamp down. When we look at what's been happening in central Mali and in Burkina Faso, and we see how rapidly those parts of the Sahel have caught fire, right? That whereas just a few years ago, everybody's saying, oh, Islamism wasn't really going to happen here. Or when it did happen in Mali, people are saying, well, it wasn't going to happen in Burkina Faso. And then boom, some spark is, forgive my metaphors here, but some spark is carried across the border. And before you know it, you've got this gigantic conflagration. And it's like, holy crap, how did this happen? Then, people look at it and they realize, well, the problem is that you've got these local disputes with these deep-seated resentments. And because of the politics being broken in these countries, and there's so little governance, there's so little anything, there's so little good ways to resolve the disputes or to deal with the disputes equitably, to manage all these problems. And then so what happens is that it's like, forgive my metaphors here, when the fuel in the forest builds up and builds up and builds up and builds up, it just requires that one errant spark, or somebody throws a cigarette out the window, and then, like, boom, you've got this powder keg. And that's what it turns out Burkina Faso was. That's what it turns out Central Mali was.
Because now you have these groups, including branches of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, fighting amongst each other, in addition to all kinds of other, a constellation of other groups.
This is how, right. So the way they do it is that Islamic State and Al-Qaeda have managed to instrumentalize all these local resentments and conflicts, and insinuate themselves, and give all these people who are local people who, for various reasons, are resentful, angry and resentful at different groups, different elites, different hierarchies, at the state, to the extent that it's there somehow siding with the people that they're angry at. You've got all these build-up resentments. And what the Islamist groups have managed to do is they've managed to provide an ideology that helps all of these local angry people to take their anger and to channel it into something, but also to identify with some larger cause. So in other words, instead of like, I'm I'm just some tribesman who's really angry at the sheikh in my village because, I don't know, because of some dispute about my sheep. And I'm just really angry at him. But it's real. My resentment is profound. I'm also really angry at the state because the state seems to side with him and everybody's corrupt. It's really terrible. But my fight is my fight, and it's not the fight of the other guy in the other village who's angry about something else. But now, because of Islamism, now I understand. I can interpret my fight in this sort of larger universal terms. And so can this other guy in the other village. So now we can make common cause, and we could also we can work together. We're now under the same flag, and now, I feel like my local fight is a bigger fight and somehow more noble too. It's a larger fight, and because it's not just I'm angry because of my sheep. I'm angry because of what the Crusaders are doing, or because of the heretics are doing, and it's all sort of in the name of God. And I'm oversimplifying here, and I don't want to make it a little bit, I'm making it a bit cartoonish, and I understand that. But the thing is that, so if we go back to Chad, we have a scenario where we have so many socioeconomic, political, ethnic cleavages, problems, resentments, and it's like it's like a powder keg. It's like this is the forest that's full of all this fuel that's just littering the forest floor, and it's sort of ripe terrain for extremists to sort of come in to organize people. By and large, from what I understand, Deby has managed to really tamp this stuff down. So he's got the advantage of being far more effective than the Malian or Burkinabe security forces are with respect to sort of sniffing these things out and stomping them out, right? These burning embers fast. But when you're dealing with a country that's so vast and has so many problems, and plus you've got these gigantic borders, you just sort of wonder if at some point it's just going to fail, right? If he's not just like, again, forgive me my metaphors, but it's also like the little boy who keeps sticking his fingers in the holes in the dike, like trying to keep it from crumbling. So to some extent, he's also doing that too. And then, of course, we have the presence of Islamic State and another faction of Boko Haram that are in the Lake Chad Basin area, who've proven that they are alive and well and dangerous, notwithstanding all of these regional and international efforts to crush them. So it was this March, I believe, I think it was March 23rd, where a column of one of these Boko Haram factions launched an attack against the Chadian military on a peninsula in Lake Chad. From what I read, I think it was even an amphibious attack because you can only get there by canoe. But they managed to kill. I never saw the exact figures, like as much as or almost 100 Chadian soldiers, and make off with a lot of weapons and vehicles. And the fact that they could do that right there, attack Chadians on Chadian territory, notwithstanding all of these efforts by the international community and this multinational force that's been operating in the area, supported by the United States and France. Like, the fact that they can do this means that they really propose a legitimate threat to Chad. And then of course the worst case scenario, and I don't know where we are in terms of realizing this, is if the Islamic State faction that's in the Sahel, in other words in Mali, Burkina Faso, really links up and coordinates closely with the Islamic State faction that is in the Lake Chad Basin area, and that becomes sort of like a real thing, with a real substantive exchange and mutual support. The point being is that to some extent, even though Gaddafi's gone and he was sort of enemy number one, and Bashir's gone, and even before Bashir was gone, Sudan had really made peace to some extent. So you could argue that the threats were greatly diminished, but you could also argue that the wolves are sort of circling around, and the environment is very dangerous.
In addition to Operation Barkhane, which you mentioned, Chad has been playing a key role in a lot of other regional security efforts, including this multinational force that's fighting Boko Haram, as well as a peacekeeping mission in Mali, which Chad contributes a lot of peacekeepers to. At what point does Deby start to get stretched too thin and sort of unable to supply soldiers and arms to all of these different places while at the same time tamping down all the domestic threats that you mentioned?
I think he's already reached that point. In the spring of this year, it might have been right after that attack in March, Deby announced that he was no longer going to participate in operations in Mali, I believe, and he wanted to. It wasn't clear if he was going to pull them out or if he just wasn't going to send more. But he was like, no, I can't do that anymore because I need to bring them home. I need to focus on the threat here because this has reached a critical level. And so the fact that he even made that announcement, again, I don't know if anything has actually changed on the ground. I don't actually know if he's withdrawn troops from Mali. I mean, troops in Mali, he had some that were part of MINUSMA, that's the UN mission in Mali. And he was also he's involved in the what's called the G5 Sahel, which is this multinational effort. And so I don't actually know if he's withdrawn troops, but he said he's got to focus the energies more on Chad, and so I don't think it's fair to say I wouldn't claim that Chad is at a breaking point now, but the elements are there. So, for instance, there's this conflict going on in northern Chad in the Tibesti region, having to do with gold mines. And the fact that there are different groups and factions that are kind of fighting over that, and Chad has, the government, Deby has dealt with it in some ways that only made, arguably are just making everything worse. Again, rather than doing things, in terms of governance and arbitration and all sorts of things to sort of make sure that there's this sort of an equitable way of managing a set of conflicts, he's taking a heavy-handed approach that could set the stage for a lot of really much worse things. Similarly, there's violence in eastern Chad, where again he's taking a heavy hand to dealing with this sort of problem, dealing with the certain Arab groups and some of their neighbors, and so there's this notion that you still have these rebels in Libya. And there's an overlap between that problem and the problem of the conflicts of the gold and Tibesti. Then you've got the issues in eastern Chad, and Central African Republic is always a problem. And then you've got the Boko Haram is clearly alive and well, and is a threat. And meanwhile, you've got the price of oil has just dropped through the floor, and then on top of everything else, there is COVID, which I don't believe, I haven't seen the latest numbers. The actual toll on Chadian public health has not been particularly profound, but the economic damage has been real, right? So the country has entered into a recession, and you already have a country that's terribly poor, and it is now getting poorer, right? Or a large number of Chadians are now much worse off because of COVID. So all of these things add up to a real struggle. And the question is, at some point, like if there's a breaking point, what does that even look like? And then also, where does it even come from? Where is the threat? Because you also have to conclude the fact that you've got, he's got France and the United States in his corner. And that is helpful for things like renegotiating loans or just trying to get credit, the sort of international financial support that can be very useful for that, steering development projects. There's all sorts of ways that can help him get out of a jam. And he also benefits, I believe, from a certain sense of maybe the sort of passivity, as sort of as a bad of a president as he is, there's worse. And I think this is part of the problem with the opposition, right? Because, if the real threats to him are guys like Timan Erdimi, who is going to be at least as bad, presumably. I mean, why think otherwise? And you don't want civil war like there was in the late 1970s. So what do you want, right? So what people want most was probably some sort of form of democratization and some way to sort of share the benefits more broadly. But I suspect that, and just my hunch, that there's just not a lot of people who are like, let's topple him, right? We got to get rid of him at all costs. And I don't really care what comes next because we just got to get rid of him. Because if you do care about what comes next, you're going to think twice about taking him out.
In other words, things would have to get a lot worse in Chad for his backers in Paris and Washington to cut him loose.
Yeah, I think so. Abre crossed some red lines, I think, because I think Abre was a far more abusive leader than Deby is. Deby's no saint from a human rights point of view, but compared to Abre, it's all relative, right? Abre was much worse. Plus, Abre had this problem where, as I said, he was perceived by some in France as being much too close to the United States. Deby doesn't have that problem. It would have to be some combination of, like, France has to somehow be willing to cut him loose, and I don't know really what that would take. It could just be that if somebody could act quickly enough that France doesn't even have time to react, and that's possible too, which means some sort of Paris coup scenario, whereas a column of vehicles racing across the country to get at N'Djamena, obviously the French are going to see that coming. Everybody's going to see that coming. So, you would have to act super fast, or just things would have to change for him to cut loose. So one could maybe imagine some scenarios where, because of opposition and unrest, that, maybe Deby starts like shooting crowds, and there's, these things are possible. And to some extent, this is what happened to Bashir, right? But we're not there yet. We really aren't. You could see, because of all of the many, many, many problems afflicting Chad, you could see how we could get there if, trends X, Y, and Z were to continue. But we're not at a point in which I would say any of that is inevitable. And which also leads us to the question of Chad's succession, right? Deby's succession, like who's going to come after him? So from what I understand, there's no designated dauphin. What there are a lot of family members, sons, in-laws, cousins that are sort of positioned, including his wife, who are in various positions of power and influence, who arguably have been groomed, but there are a bunch of them. But, short of there being some kind of clear designation, it seems to me like if he would have just sort of died today, that what happens is that then all those relatives, it's like Knives Out, right? All those relatives are just going to go after one another. And so, that's not a nice prospect, certainly not for France, right? Which is so invested, at least in having at the very least in having access to the bases in N'Djamena, right? And using Chad and needing Chad as a partner. That's not something that France wants at all. And, the U.S. to a lesser extent, but it's not something that we welcome. Also because none of these family members is likely to suddenly prove to be a great nation builder who's going to develop Chad and introduce democracy, right? So it's kind of a dilemma. This is it's a classic. It's a dilemma for Western powers, for France and the United States too. It's like, pragmatism versus principle and versus morals and all of the values that we like to say that we espouse in the international scene. How do we balance all of these things? And this is why Deby keeps staying alive, right? How he maintains support, because I think he knows all of this, and he's always very good at making sure that the balance is always on his side here. And maybe this alone is what would keep him from massacring people in the streets, right? Because I feel like he's smart enough to know this. He's savvy enough to know that France could turn on him at a dime in such a scenario. So why create that possibility?
Did you see anything notable from this month's cabinet reshuffle, which I think a lot of analysts saw as a sign that he's gearing up to run and presumably win again in next year's election?
No, I don't see that as notable. Okay, he's going to go through the exercise of holding an election, but I don't see, based on the way the past elections have gone, I don't see any reason to think that there's going to be any meaningful opposition to him. He's done such a good job of dividing people, splintering people, co-opting people, paying off whomever needs to be paid off, that the ability of the many opposition groups to organize themselves into any kind of effective coalition, I think, is really very low. It's almost to the point where when you're really good, you don't actually need to rig elections, right? You don't ever have to take that step, like ballot boxing, that's sort of for ballot stuffing, that's sort of for amateurs. And I just sort of feel like the way the political landscape is that Deby's at that point now where he doesn't have to stuff a single ballot. I don't see it happening. It really is. It's a shame because he could be using his power in ways that are more beneficial in the long term for his country. And he really, really hasn't done that. And there are examples of powers elsewhere in the world and also in Africa of governments and dictators sort of using their time more wisely. Some reason Jerry Rawlings comes to mind in Ghana, who didn't start off as such a nice guy, but he kind of managed what ends up to being a meaningful, enduring democratic transition. Or you could take Kagame in Rwanda, who at least says, people debate this, of course, who's holding onto power. He's very anti-democratic, but at the same time, like he says, he makes his case that it's necessary given Rwanda's many problems, but he likes to think of himself as the autocratic founder of Singapore, whose name escapes me.
Lee Kuan Yew.
Exactly. And he built institutions and investments and that really helped develop the country and really set the country on a path towards both incredible economic development, but also fully fledged democracy. And, Kagame likes to pretend that he likes to say, that's the image that he likes to try to create. Now, is any of this true? Is he ever actually accomplished anything? That's very debatable, but at least, you have to credit him with this understanding that, he should at least try, or like this is still sort of a valid objective. I don't see Deby doing that, and the fact that he looted the money, the oil revenue that was supposedly set aside because of his agreement with the World Bank to buy weapons, and the relative lack of development is just it's really problematic. Like there are ways that he could have been trying to create institutions such that they would be some meaningful legacy. But I feel like, I wonder what is the legacy that he's going to leave behind when he goes. It's hard to point to anything really very, very positive.
Michael, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Michael Shurkin is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, where he focuses on West African security issues and U.S. and European strategy. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and WPR on Twitter, and while you're at it, don't forget to sign up for our free daily newsletter. It's the best way to keep up with what we're publishing, and you'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.